It's one of history's biggest ever trading scandals, losses of nearly $7 billion. And Jerome Kerviel is the rogue trader taking the flak. Kerviel insists he's being made a scapegoat by his former employer, Societe Generale. So just who is to blame for risky banking transactions, and can they ever be stopped? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Laura Kyle. Welcome to the programme. Jerome Kerviel, an opportunist with bad timing, or a product of a high-risk culture, or perhaps even just a pawn in a flawed financial system. Branded a rogue trader, Kerviel was an authorised employee making unauthorised trades on behalf of his bank, hoping for huge profits, risking huge losses. All is well and good, so long as the trader is making money for his clients and employer. But when they start incurring losses, they're suddenly labelled rogue and taken to task. Jackie Rowland has this report on Kerviel's day in court.
Arriving at court to learn his fate, Jerome Kerviel, rogue trader turned cult figure in a case that nearly brought down one of France's oldest banks. Kerviel was accused of risking huge amounts of Societe Generale's money and racking up losses of nearly $7 billion. Summing up the case, the presiding judge said Jerome Kerviel had lost complete touch with economic reality and that he was responsible for his actions. His lawyer, who had argued that the bank rather than Kerviel was to blame, said he was astounded at the judgment.
It's incomprehensible. It's a judgment that says he alone was responsible for everything. It's a judgment that says that a bank that he helped create, that he built, is responsible for nothing, even though it acted with negligence.
In a book published earlier this year, Jerome Kerviel claims he was not the only one at Societe Generale taking huge risks. He said the bank tacitly accepted these practices and claimed he fell out of favour only when his profits turned into losses, an argument the bank rejects.
This judgment recognises Societe Generale had no knowledge of Jerome Kerviel's fraud. Societe Generale was totally oblivious to the organisation, to the system, to the lies, to the forged documents, all the things which enabled Kerviel to fool the management of the bank.
Jerome Kerviel now faces 3 years behind bars. He has also been ordered to pay back the $7 billion he lost. For many people in France, capitalism itself was on trial here. There's a widely held feeling that Jerome Kerviel was not a villain, but rather a victim of a system that encouraged greed and excessive risk-taking. Jackie Rowland, Al Jazeera, Paris.
So plenty to talk about here today, and here to help us do it are our guests in London. Nick Leeson, he's a former trader at BARINGS Bank and is accused of risky tradings that caused the collapse of that bank, which was later sold for £1. Also in London, David BUICK, senior strategist at BGC Partners, and in Paris, Max Kaiser, a financial analyst. Mr. Kaiser, I'd like to start with you. Kerviel solely responsible for his actions, was he?
Well, you have to understand how the banking business works these days. It's organized like a drug cartel, and Kerviel is just like a street corner drug dealer that got busted. All the layers that protect the street dealers from the management are in place, and meanwhile, the senior management, the chairman, the CEO, should be in jail. They should be facing justice. They're part of a criminal racket dealing in derivatives and counterfeit securities.
Do you think he's been made a scapegoat for the banking system as a whole?
Well, again, using the drug cartel and the drug business model, the cops can say, or the regulators can say, oh, we got one of the bad guys, but the big fish are let free. So they just put a very small fish behind bars, and they let the big criminals, the CEO, chairman, board of directors at SOCGEN, those guys, the derivative lords, are allowed to go free, even though they should be in jail, if not worse.
David BUICK, do you believe that Societe Generale got off scot-free and indeed should have?
I don't think to see how they could have got off scot-free. They incurred a loss of $4.9 billion euros from that gentleman alone and his derivative positions, together with other substantial losses in other areas which most banks in the world of investment banking suffered from. There's no question of any doubt about it that their computer systems and their check systems were wholly inadequate, and that obviously saw the resignation of Monsieur Daniel Bouton as chief executive a couple of years ago. But that doesn't give somebody the license to exceed his limits, breach his trust, and hack into a computer, and then turn around in the next breath saying nothing to do with me, Gov. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I'm afraid he's got his just desserts, and that's the way it is. I mean, you cannot do that. He was never in a particularly senior position, and therefore to exceed his limits to the tune of being able to make losses of 4.9 billion euros, well, by my standards, it's absolutely astronomical.
Indeed. Max Kaiser, at what point does Kerviel bear, or should he bear, some individual responsibility for this?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about something. He saved the bank billions of dollars. As a result of the timing of this, of course, SOCGEN had to close out many derivative positions ahead of the global meltdown in 2008. As a result, they went into the meltdown, which was perpetrated by their fellow conspirators in the global counterfeiting scheme, other banks. They went into the crisis in a better capital ratio position than many other banks. He actually saved the bank billions of dollars. He should be put on the board of directors of the bank. And for the management to suggest that he wasn't doing what exactly he was told by management is fallacious. They should be in jail. They're criminals. They're counterfeiters.
Okay, Nick Leeson, let's bring you into the discussion here. You yourself, one of the world's best-known former rogue traders. You're responsible for the bankruptcy of BARINGS Bank back in 1995 when you lost 1.3 billion. Now, Kerviel's losses were 4 times greater than that. Does it surprise you?
Look, I was personally astounded when it happened. Growing up in the derivatives markets through the early 90s, Societe Generale were always at the cutting edge of the derivatives market. So, you know, everybody held them in great esteem, and for something like this to happen to them was a shock to me. I'm sure that everybody expects me to side with Jerome Kerviel. The opposite is true. I mean, you have to take responsibility for your actions. He traded illegally outside of his position limits, and he got his just desserts.
David BUICK, do you think that the banks should indeed have spotted that something was afoot?
As I said, first and foremost, I endorse Nick Leeson's comments 100%. But as I said before, that clearly their computer system and their check system as regards to credit and risk was wholly inadequate. Of course it was. And basically, if there had been a closer understanding of what Monsieur Kerviel got up to and who he was actually being managed by, perhaps some of this may have been avoided. But it still doesn't get away from the fact that he exceeded his limits, because there's no way, since night follows day, that somebody of that limited experience, clever bloke though he was, would have been allowed to trade up to $42 billion worth of derivatives without management control. And if management had known about it, they would have jumped on him.
So he's incurred a jail sentence of 3 years. Do you think that's too harsh?
No, I don't, because I think you have to set down the stall. I mean, I have to say something that I think Nick Leeson, after that, behaved in an exemplary manner. He knew he was wrong in the end. He took his punishment, and he's recovered dramatically, and full marks to him. But I just think that this is a serious breach of trust. It's a serious breach of hacking into a computer. And as far as I'm personally concerned, from what we know of the individual, it strikes me as criminal behavior, and it must be brought to book.
Matt Kaiser, experts have been suggesting that there's no way that he could have been carrying this on without his supervisors noticing. What do you think?
Well, this idea of the position limits, let's keep in mind that Societe Generale and every other major French bank and every other bank in the world routinely exceeds their minimum capital requirement ratios as set up by Basel II and Basel III, using these derivatives to bypass those laws routinely. That's a much bigger issue because it's causing a global financial meltdown, just not the inconveniences for one guy who, on one given situation, was again, fully within the purview of his supervisors, doing what he was told to do. That's not really the issue here. The issue is the entire banking system has gone way over their position limits. They're flooding the globe with these basically counterfeit securities, derivative securities. There's no intention of them to pay these bonds back. And now you see what's happening in other markets like the gold market. The gold vigilantes are sussing this out. They know that these banks are without any capital whatsoever, and they're going to crash the system because nobody's willing to go after the big fish here, the big criminals, the board of director, the CEO of Societe Generale. These guys are crashing the entire system for their own gain, and no one's going after them, which is it's just too bad because many people are going to be suffering as a consequence.
David Buick, I can see you shaking your head there. No one prepared to go after the big fish. Do you agree with that?
With great respect, I understand anybody who's angry wanting to vent their spleen, but that's just nonsense. I mean, if we haven't spent the last 2 years trying to tighten up regulation between the central banks, between the world governments, and internally, I don't think anybody, whoever they were, enjoyed the outcome of what happened in 2007 and 8. And to think that people are perfectly happy to let it happen again, I'm sorry, I can't subscribe to that view at all.
And Nick Leeson, there is an idea put forward that you are a hero whilst you're making the bank's money. You only become a villain when you bring them losses. Would you agree with that?
Look, everybody who works in a bank is there ultimately to make money. So, you know, you can draw that analogy if you so wish. As in my case and as in the case of Jerome Kerviel, there were perceived profits, or there was a period that he was making profit. When that turned bad and it went into losses, he exceeded his position, he risked many multiples of what his trading limit was. But he did that knowingly. It's just the same as me. I knew what I was doing, I knew I shouldn't be doing it, continued all the same, and therefore you have to take full responsibility for everything that happens from that point forward. When you enter into it, you don't enter into it with any criminal intent. I don't believe. I certainly didn't. In my case, it was a series of stupid decisions that ultimately ended up where I did. But I did it. You know, I knew what I was doing was wrong. It was inherently unethical as I entered into those first transactions, right through to the last transaction, and therefore you have to take responsibility. Just the idea that the bank isn't culpable, again, is one that I find completely ridiculous at the moment. And opening my newspapers this morning to read that the judgment of $4.9 billion or 4.9 billion euros against Jerome Kerviel completely exonerates the bank is completely ridiculous. They didn't have the necessary systems and controls in place. They didn't have the degree of regulation or the quality of regulation. Quality is the key issue for me here. The quality of regulation and systems and the quality of systems and controls that they should have had in place, and that's why they lost the money that they did. You know, whether people further along the line should be, charged in court is for the courts to decide. Certainly in the case of BARINGS years ago, it was me, only me. Nobody else knew what was going on. They should have known what was going on. That is clear and apparent to everybody, as they should have known what was going on at Societe Generale. The biggest thing that they could be guilty of is just plain stupidity.
Sorry to interrupt. It does appear that Europe, the banking systems, are at least trying to address this situation. Kerviel's tradings first came to light during the initial aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, and that's when the financial organisations around the world were being closely scrutinised. EU countries have since proposed and implemented several reforms to try to prevent repeated collapse. Now, they've looked at ways of strengthening banking supervision, and early next year they'll be establishing the European Systemic Risk Board. That's to try and ensure financial stability in the region. In addition, credit rating agencies are to be registered and closely supervised. European banks will be required to hold a capital that equates at least 7% of their risk-bearing assets. The bank have also capped traders' bonuses in a bid to tackle a risk-taking culture. Also, the EU is restricting non-EU fund managers searching for European investors. So it does appear that the will to address these flaws that have proved so fatal to our economies does appear to exist. Max Kaiser, is it enough?
Well, just to get back to a point that was made previously about no banks want to repeat the crisis of 2 years ago. The crisis of 2 years ago never went away. What we're finding out, and the key word here is disclosure. Jerome was not fully disclosing his positions. Neither is the Allied Irish Bank or the Bank of Ireland disclosing their massive debt positions. Neither did the banks in Greece disclose their massive debt positions. That was hidden from view by the likes of Goldman Sachs, one of Societe Generale's good friends in the criminal syndicate. So these banks are complicit in a global failure to disclose billions, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars of debt, and we're still working through the disclosure. They're not disclosing. They're committing crimes right now. Every single one of these bankers a year from now will be discussing the crimes that they're committing today. And the tragedy of this Jerome Kerviel verdict is that we're focusing on one low-level derivatives dealer and ignoring the high-level crime syndicators in the global banking system that are totally destroying the global system.
Okay, Nick Leeson, that culture of risk, according to Max Kaiser, still incredibly pervasive in this banking society. I'm trying to get an idea of what would inspire an individual trader to take on so many more risks than perhaps he has to.
Well, I don't. As I said before, I don't think you start doing it intentionally. It's a very perverse set of. Well, it's a very perverse situation. You know, you break the rule initially. You make a loss. You try to cover that up. You try to hide it. Over a period of time, you realise that the systems and controls aren't in place to stop you. And perversely, you continue to trade, take on more risks to try and get those losses back. It then becomes apparent that there's even less systems and controls than you initially thought, and you continue to go. And it's only when something, you know, finite happens to stop you. And in the case of Barings, there was no more money available. You know, I'd used up the capital base of twice the capital base of the bank. They couldn't access any more money from other banks that were lending them money. They went to the stock market, they issued a bond for £100 million. That came out to me in Singapore, and there was no more money to fund the positions, so it had to stop. And it was only at that time that the whole story came to light. With Jerome Kerviel's, it's because people were starting to ask questions. Eurex, Bank of France were looking at the positions that SOCGEN had and said, is somebody really in control of what's going on? And when those questions were asked, it went down the line, and Kerviel's deceit was exposed at the time.
Do you think at any point he actually wanted out?
Look, we all want out, but you get so far in you can't get out. It's a very difficult thing to explain. You get into situations where, you know, I mean, success was the thing that I craved throughout my life. You know, success was the thing that I wanted more than anything else. And the fear of failure was the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. I'd never been in a situation where I'd failed until that time. And I think the fear of failure keeps you going as much as that need for success. And it is an industry that is built around success. The more success you have, the more money that you make, the more prominent you become within the organisation. But we all go into that with our eyes open. That's what we want. That's what the industry is about. It's about making money and trying to make more money than anybody else. But we all go in with our eyes open, and to suggest otherwise is not correct.
David Buick, to what extent do you think these banks, whether or not overtly, are encouraging these young traders to break the rules?
No, I don't think they're encouraging them to break the rules at all. I think Nick made a marvellous point, which needs reiterating as far as I'm concerned, is that one of the best attributes a dealer can ever have is to know how to take a loss. And the fact remains is that Mr. Kerviel didn't know how to take a loss because he couldn't face reality. And the fact remains is that always at the back of the mind is that because he'd done well previously, he thought he could win that round by playing big and therefore end up with a reasonable bonus. I can only assume that was his rationale. No bank management ever encourages a bank to go over the top and take risks that simply they cannot afford. You have to remember that the banks have proved to be such easy meat for the general public in blaming them for all the ails that happened between 2000 and 2010. It's simply nonsense. The people who are more culpable than anybody else are the governments. The governments encouraged, through times of recession, banks to lend money in an indiscriminate manner without proper regulation, allow bank balance sheets to grow to ridiculous levels. Look at the Royal Bank of Scotland, £2 trillion. For a bank of that size, it's just nonsense. And of course the regulation was not good enough, either internally in the banks or on an official basis.
Okay, Max Kaiser, you have something to say?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, that's just a false statement that your other guest made. I mean, banks routinely throw their entire capitalization on the line on a daily basis, and they commit massive fraud. Look at Lehman Brothers. They had a separate bank called their alter ego bank, where they had a $50 billion line of credit to do just that. And when the regulators looked at this, they found that every bank on Wall Street and every bank of Europe has a similar scam going, with side banks, side bets, completely violating the law, completely violating the Basel requirements. And, you know, it's a shame, really, that your guest is supporting the pimps at Societe Generale. They pimp out a guy like Jerome Kerviel, who's out there flogging their counterfeit securities. He gets caught, and the pimps walk free. I'm surprised to hear your other guest supporting the pimps in the banking system.
David, your response to that?
My response to that? No, I mean, I don't think any of those things that Matt has suggested, that I support, you know, skullduggery in any bank or support the SG management in any way. I'm just saying that the fact remains is, whether we like it or not, Mr. Kerviel, or Monsieur Kerviel, should I say, has to, you know, stand up and be counted. The great thing is, if he wants to put it that way, is the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get found out. He got found out, and therefore he has to pay the price.
Indeed he did, and Nick Leeson, you did too. You would have thought that your experience would be enough of a deterrent to other traders, and yet it appears that it keeps happening.
Well, you would expect it to be enough of a deterrent, and I'd like to think, if I was in that situation years ago and I was aware of the ramifications of my actions. I spent 4.5 years in prison in a very difficult environment, and I'd like to think if I was aware of that, I wouldn't have made or I would have stopped at some time during the illegal trading that was going on and put my hands up, because, you know, there's operational risk, there's reputational risk from the banks, but there's also personal risk. And I didn't understand what it was, and I'm sure Jerome Kerviel, I think a 3-year sentence with 2 years, or a 5-year sentence with 2 years of it suspended, is probably a fair return. I mean, it's probably the question I find most difficult to ask when people say, was your sentence just? I stood in front of the judge, I accepted the decision that he handed down, and I've accepted everything that's happened to me since that time. Likewise, I often get asked, should have other people stood trial? No, they shouldn't. I was the one that initiated the trades. I was the one that led everybody up the garden path by false accounting, just as Jerome Kerviel did. So, you know, the responsibility lands with the individual, but it shouldn't detract from the wider picture that the controls at the bank were poor, inadequate, and should be far better than they were. And therefore, their reputation has suffered as a result, and that is correct also.
And gentlemen, I'm afraid we will have to leave it there for now. I'm sure the discussion will be continuing for some time. In London, former rogue trader Nick Leeson, also in London, David BUICK, senior strategist at BGC Partners, and in Paris, Max Kaiser, financial analyst. And thank you for joining us. We welcome your comments and suggestions as ever. Do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.